Hello, everyone. Tonight, we enter the ballrooms of Victorian England, where beauty came at a terrible price, where the most fashionable color of the season was slowly killing those who wore it, where young women danced in gowns so lovely they literally glowed, not knowing that every waltz, every turn, every breath released poison into the air. You might imagine Victorian fashion as merely restrictive corsets and elaborate etiquette, but tonight, set that simple image aside. You are not a distant observer. You are standing in a dress shop in 1862, running your fingers over the most exquisite green fabric you have ever seen. It shimmers like leaves in sunlight. The shopkeeper assures you it is the height of fashion. Everyone who is anyone wears this shade. What she does not tell you, what she herself may not know, is that this beautiful green is made from arsenic, and it is killing people. So before we descend into this elegant nightmare, take a moment to like the video if these strange historical tales fascinate you. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, settle in, find your comfort. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the modern world recede. There is nothing you must do. Only listen to the story of beauty that became death. Take a deep breath. Release the present. And let me tell you about the dresses that killed. To understand the arsenic dress scandal, we must first understand the Victorian obsession with a particular shade of green. Not just any green, but a specific, brilliant, luminous green that seemed to glow with its own light. It was called Scheele's green, or later, Paris green, emerald green, and a dozen other romantic names. But chemists knew it by its proper name, copper arsenite, or copper arsenic, bonded to copper, creating the most vivid green the world had ever seen. Before the 19th century, creating truly vibrant colors was expensive and difficult. Most dyes came from natural sources like plants, minerals, and insects. They were beautiful but often dull or prone to fading. The wealthy could afford rich colors like Tyrian purple, extracted from thousands of sea snails, or cochineal red, made from crushed insects. But most people wore muted, earthy tones that reflected the limitations of natural pigments. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, synthetic chemistry. Scientists began creating colors in laboratories, colors that nature had never produced, colors more brilliant and stable than anything seen before. And none was more spectacular than the arsenical greens. The story begins in 1775, with a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele. He was experimenting with arsenic trioxide, a white powder that had been known since ancient times as a deadly poison. Mixing it with copper sulfate and other chemicals, Scheele created a vibrant green pigment. It was cheap to produce, brilliantly colored, and remarkably stable. It did not fade in sunlight like vegetable dyes. It could be applied to almost any material. It was, from a commercial standpoint, perfect. Scheele's green quickly became popular for painting walls, coloring paper, dyeing fabric, and creating artificial flowers. By the early 1800s, it was everywhere in fashionable homes. But there was a problem that Scheele either did not recognize or chose to ignore. The pigment was poisonous. Not just mildly toxic, but seriously dangerous. And unlike lead, which had to be ingested to cause harm, arsenic could be absorbed through the skin or inhaled as dust. In 1814, another chemist, a German named Wilhelm, improved on Scheele's formula, creating an even more brilliant green. This became known as Schweinfurt green or Paris green. It contained even more arsenic than the original, and it became widely fashionable. By the 1850s, arsenical greens dominated Victorian fashion and interior design. The shade was everywhere. It was the color of wealth, of modernity, of fashion. Queen Victoria herself had green wallpaper in her palace. The shade appeared on dresses, ribbons, gloves, shoes, hats adorned with green feathers, and artificial flowers. It colored the artificial leaves on ladies' bonnets, the wreaths that decorated hair, the trimmings on ball gowns. It was painted on children's toys, on book covers, on calling cards. Entire rooms were done in green. The walls papered in arsenical green, the curtains dyed green, the carpets woven with green patterns, even the lampshades that cast a green glow over evening gatherings. Tivik loved this green with a passion that seems almost irrational from our perspective. But we must understand the context. This was an age of rapid change, of scientific progress, of imperial confidence. Synthetic colors represented human triumph over nature, the ability to improve upon what God had made. The brighter, the more artificial, the better. Natural was old-fashioned. Synthetic was modern, progressive, civilized. and green had particular cultural associations. It was the color of nature, of spring, of youth, of fertility. In the language of flowers that Victorians obsessed over, green represented life, hope, and renewal. To wear green was to present oneself as fresh, vital, alive. For young women making their debut in society, green was an obvious choice. It symbolized their youth and availability for marriage. The fashion press reinforced this obsession. Gotti's Ladies' Book, the most influential fashion magazine in America, regularly featured illustrations of green dresses and promoted green as the essential color of the season. Ladies' periodicals in England did the same. To be fashionable was to wear green. To wear green was to be modern, cultured, wealthy. But almost from the beginning, there were problems. People were getting sick. Not dramatically, not obviously. Not in ways that could be immediately traced to their clothing or their wallpaper. But sick, nonetheless. Chronic illnesses that doctors could not explain. Mysterious deaths that were attributed to weak constitutions or divine providence. The first hints of trouble came from the people who made the green products. Workers in factories that produced arsenical pigments began to suffer. They developed skin lesions, respiratory problems, weakness, nausea, sommeil, diète. The connection between the green pigments and the workers' illnesses was fairly obvious. Arsenic was a known poison, but factory owners largely ignored the problem. Workers were expendable. There were always more desperate people willing to take dangerous jobs for low wages. Dressmakers and millers. The women who sewed the fashionable clothing also began to show symptoms. They spent hours each day handling green fabric, cutting it, sewing it, sometimes putting pins in their mouths that had touched the green material. They breathed in the fine particles that were released when fabric was cut or shaken. Many developed chronic illness. Some died young. But again, the connection was not made, or was ignored. These were working-class women. Their health problems were attributed to poverty, poor sanitation, immoral lifestyles. Anything but the beautiful green fabric they worked with. It was the wealthy, the consumers of fashion, whose illnesses finally began to attract attention. And even then, it took decades for the truth to be widely acknowledged. Consider the case of a young woman attending a ball in London in 1862. She is 19 years old, the daughter of a prosperous merchant. This is her second season, and she is anxious to make a good impression. She has commissioned a new dress for the occasion, a ball gown of the latest style. The bodice is fitted, the sleeves are short and puffed. The skirt is enormous, held out by a steel crinoline frame, and the entire dress is made of the most fashionable fabric available. A green silk so bright it seems to emit its own light. She is laced into a corset, reducing her waist to the fashionable 18 inches. The corset is so tight she can barely breathe. But this is normal, expected, part of being a lady. Over the corset goes the chemise, then the multiple petticoats, then the crinoline frame, then finally, the green dress. The dressmaker has used yards and yards of fabric. The skirt alone contains perhaps 15 yards of material, all of it dyed with arsenical green. The young woman looks at herself in the mirror and is delighted. The green brings out the color of her eyes. The style is perfectly fashionable. She knows she will be admired. Her mother fastens a necklace around her throat, and they depart for the ball. The ballroom is crowded, hot, brilliantly lit by gas, lamps and candles. Hundreds of people are pressed together, dancing, talking, flirting. The heat is intense. Within minutes, everyone is perspiring. The young woman in the green dress begins to feel warm, then hot, then uncomfortably hot. Sweat forms on her forehead, her neck, her chest. The tight corset makes breathing difficult. She feels slightly dizzy, but attributes it to the heat and the excitement. What she does not know is that as she perspires, her sweat is reacting with the arsenical dye in her dress. The moisture is causing the arsenic to leach from the fabric onto her skin. Some of it is being absorbed directly into her body through her pores. More concerning, as the dress moves and rubs against itself and against her body, tiny particles of the dye are being released into the air as dust. She is breathing in arsenic with every breath, so is everyone near her. The gentlemen who dance with her, holding her close, are inhaling arsenic. The ladies who stand near her, chatting and fanning themselves, are inhaling arsenic. The servants who pass through with trays of refreshment are inhaling arsenic. The musicians in the gallery above are inhaling arsenic. An entire ballroom full of people is being slowly poisoned, and no one knows it. The young woman dances for dances. By the end of the fourth, she feels unwell. Her head aches. She feels nauseous. Her skin itches and burns. She tells her mother she needs to sit down to get some air. They retire to a sitting room, and after resting for a time, she feels slightly better. She attributes her illness to the heat, to excitement, perhaps to the lobster she ate at supper. It never occurs to her that her dress is poisoning her. They return home in the early hours of morning. The young woman is exhausted. Her mother helps her undress, unlacing the corset, removing the layers of clothing. When the green dress is removed, they notice that the young woman's skin is red and irritated everywhere. The dress touched it directly. Her mother assumes this is from the heat and the friction of dancing. She applies a soothing lotion and helps her daughter into bed. The young woman sleeps poorly. She has nightmares. She wakes feeling worse than when she went to bed. Over the next few days, she develops a rash, stomach pains, a persistent headache. The family doctor is called. He examines her and diagnoses nervous exhaustion, a condition he believes is common in young ladies of sensitive temperament. He prescribes rest, fresh air, and a tonic. He does not ask about her clothing. It does not occur to him. The young woman rests, and slowly her acute symptoms fade. But she notices something odd. Whenever she wears the green dress again, even just for an afternoon call, she feels unwell afterward. She mentions this to her mother, who dismisses it. The dress is expensive, beautiful, fashionable. Surely the illness is coincidental. Young ladies are prone to mysterious ailments. It is their nature. But the young woman is perceptive. She begins to suspect the dress. She asks her dressmaker about the dye. The dressmaker assures her it is perfectly safe, used by all the best establishments, worn by ladies of the highest quality. The young woman wants to believe this, but her body is telling her something different. She is not alone in her suspicions. By the 1860s, there were growing murmurs in medical circles about arsenical poisoning from clothing and household goods. A few brave doctors were beginning to speak out, but they faced enormous resistance. The fashion industry had billions of dollars invested in arsenical dyes. Manufacturers, fabric merchants, dressmakers, department stores, all had a vested interest in denying any problem. They insisted that dyes were safe, that any illness was coincidental or due to other causes. They had powerful allies. The chemical companies that produced the pigments published pamphlets claiming their products were harmless. They funded studies that found no connection between arsenic and illness. They attacked the credibility of doctors who raised concerns, and the public largely wanted to believe them. People did not want to give up their beautiful green dresses, their fashionable green wallpaper, their lovely green ribbons and flowers. They had invested money and emotional attachment in these things. To acknowledge they were poisonous would be to acknowledge they had been foolish, had endangered themselves and their families. It was easier to deny, to rationalize, to blame something else. But the evidence was mounting. Doctors who treated the wealthy began to notice patterns. Young women who wore green dresses frequently developed mysterious skin rashes, headaches, nausea, weakness. Children who slept in nurseries with green wallpaper were chronically ill. Families who redecorated in green seemed to suffer more illness than those who chose other colors. In 1862, a doctor named Matilda Chaplin-Araton published an article in the periodical, The English Woman's Domestic Magazine. She was one of the first women to qualify as a doctor in Britain, and she had been treating several cases of arsenic poisoning that she traced to green dresses. Her article was detailed and damning. She described how arsenic in fabric could be absorbed through the skin, especially when combined with perspiration. She explained how arsenic dust could be inhaled. She documented cases of severe illness and even death that she attributed to arsenic clothing. The article caused a sensation. Some readers were horrified and immediately disposed of their green garments, but many others refused to believe it. The fashion press largely ignored or dismissed Ayrton's warnings. The chemical industry attacked her credibility, suggesting she was exaggerating, that she was hysterical, that she was trying to make a name for herself by spreading panic. But Ayrton persisted. She was joined by other doctors, particularly those who treated industrial workers and had seen firsthand the effects of arsenic exposure. They began publishing case studies, conducting experiments, analyzing the arsenic content of fashionable fabrics. 1. Particularly telling experiment was conducted in 1863. A chemist named Frederick Grace Calvert examined a single ball gown trimmed with arsenical green artificial flowers. He found that the dress contained enough arsenic to poison dozens of people. He calculated that a woman wearing such a dress at a ball, dancing and perspiring, could release enough arsenic dust into the air to affect everyone in the room. Other experiments confirmed these findings. Scientists scraped arsenic powder from green fabrics and fed it to laboratory animals. The animals died. They analyzed the urine of women who wore green dresses and found elevated levels of arsenic. They examined the corpses of young women who had died mysteriously and found arsenic in their organs. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet the fashion industry continued to deny it. They argued that the amounts of arsenic were too small to cause harm. They claimed that arsenic had been used in pigments for decades, without problem. They suggested that the symptoms doctors described were the result of suggestion and hysteria. What finally began to turn public opinion was not scientific evidence, but emotional stories. Newspapers began publishing accounts of specific victims, young women with names and faces, whose deaths could be traced to their clothing. There was the story of a 19-year-old girl who wore a green wreath in her hair to a dance. By the end of the evening, her forehead where the wreath had rested was covered in ulcers. She developed a fever and died within 2 weeks. The wreath, when analyzed, was found to contain massive amounts of arsenic. There was the story of a wealthy family whose entire household became ill after redecorating their home in green. The wallpaper, which covered nearly every room, released arsenic dust as it aged and flaked. The family's 4 children developed chronic respiratory problems. 2 of them died. The surviving children were sent to live with relatives in a different house, and their health immediately improved. There was the story of a dressmaker in London who specialized in green garments. She worked with the fabric every day, breathing in the dust, absorbing the poison through her hands. She developed a terrible cough, lost weight, became increasingly weak. Her doctor diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis, but when she stopped working with green fabric, her symptoms improved. She returned to work, and her illness returned. This cycle repeated several times before she finally made the connection and changed professions. But the damage was done. She died at age 30-2. These stories, published in newspapers and magazines, circulated at dinner parties and tea gatherings, began to change minds. People started to question whether fashion was worth dying for. Some women began to refuse to wear green. Some families had their green wallpaper removed. But the change was slow. The fashion industry was powerful, and fashion itself was a form of social power. To be unfashionable was to be socially dead, especially for women whose entire value in society was tied to their appearance and their ability to attract a good marriage. The pressure to conform, to wear what everyone else wore, was immense. And there was another problem. Arsenic was not only in green dyes, it was everywhere in Victorian life. It was in cosmetics, used to create a fashionable pale complexion. It was in medicines, prescribed as a tonic. It was in rat poison, used in every home and business. It was in insecticides, used on crops. It was in embalming fluid. It was in the glass of mirrors and the pigments of oil paintings. Victorian society was saturated with arsenic, and disentangling the specific harms of green dresses from the general background of arsenic exposure was nearly impossible. Moreover, arsenic poisoning is cumulative and insidious. Small exposures over time can be as deadly as a single large dose, and the symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are vague and varied, making diagnosis difficult, especially in an era before modern toxicology. Headaches, fatigue, skin rashes, gastrointestinal problems, all of these could have dozens of other causes. Only when someone was exposed to large amounts of arsenic were the symptoms obvious and specific. This made it easy for the industry to deny responsibility. They could point to individual cases and say, "How do you know it was the dress? Perhaps she was ill for other reasons. Perhaps she was exposed to arsenic elsewhere. Perhaps her illness was unrelated," and without the ability to prove causation in individual cases. Doctors and activists struggled to make their case to the public, but they kept trying. Through the 1860s and 1870s, the anti-arsenic campaign grew stronger. Medical journals published increasingly dire warnings. Chemists conducted public experiments, demonstrating how easily arsenic could be released from fabrics. Activists lobbied for government regulation. In 1871, a particular tragedy gave the campaign new momentum. A woman named Emma Dunbar, wife of a prosperous merchant, commissioned a ball gown for her daughter's coming out. The dress was elaborate, covered in artificial flowers and leaves, all dyed with arsenical green. The daughter wore it to 3 balls over the course of a month. After the 3rd ball, she became violently ill. She developed severe skin lesions, vomiting, convulsions. She died within a week. The family commissioned an analysis of the dress. It contained enough arsenic to kill 20 people. The Dunbar case received extensive press coverage. The family was respectable, wealthy, socially prominent. This was not a factory worker or a poor seamstress who could be dismissed as expendable. This was a young lady of quality, killed by her own clothing. The story horrified the upper classes because it made clear that no one was safe. Wealth and status could not protect you from poisonous fashion. Public pressure began to mount for government action. Activists demanded that arsenical dyes be banned or at least regulated, but they faced powerful opposition. The chemical industry lobbied hard against any restrictions. They argued that banning arsenical dyes would destroy businesses, cost jobs, harm the economy. They insisted the products were safe when properly used, and that any problems were due to misuse or poor quality control. The fashion industry joined the opposition. Dressmakers, fabric merchants, department stores, all argued that arsenical greens were essential to their business. No other dye produced colors as brilliant and stable. If these dyes were banned, they claimed, fashion would suffer, businesses would close, and Britain would lose its competitive edge in the global textile trade. And there was another argument, one that seems almost unbelievable from a modern perspective, but was taken seriously at the time. Some industry representatives argued that even if arsenical dyes were somewhat dangerous, the risk was acceptable, because beauty and fashion were so important. Women needed to be beautiful. Society required it. If beauty came with some risk, well, that was the price women paid for fulfilling their social role. This argument was not as cynical as it might sound. In Victorian society, a woman's appearance was genuinely her most important asset. Her ability to attract a husband determined her entire future, her social status, her financial security, her life prospects. An unfashionable woman, an unattractive woman, might not marry at all, condemning her to poverty and social irregularity. In this context, the risk of poisoning might seem preferable to the certainty of social death. But slowly, incrementally, attitudes began to change. More doctors spoke out. More cases were publicized. More women experienced illness they could trace to their green clothing. And gradually, green began to fall out of fashion. This was not due to government regulation, at least not initially. It was due to social pressure and market forces. Women began to avoid green because they feared it. Dressmakers began to offer alternatives because their clients demanded them. Fabric merchants began to stock non-arsenical dyes because retailers refused to buy arsenical ones. By the 1880s, bright green was no longer the height of fashion. Other colors had become popular. More importantly, new synthetic dyes had been developed that could produce brilliant colors without using arsenic. These aniline dyes, derived from coal tar, had their own problems, but they were not acutely poisonous in the way arsenical dyes were. The transition was not immediate or complete. Arsenical pigments continued to be used in some products well into the 20th century. Wallpaper manufacturers were particularly slow to change, and green wallpaper remained a hazard for decades. But in fashion, in the clothing that women wore on their body, arsenical greens gradually disappeared. In 1895, the British government finally passed regulations limiting the use of arsenic in consumer products. Similar laws were enacted in other countries, but by then, the market had already largely moved on. The regulations codified what had become standard practice. The arsenic dress scandal is a fascinating case study in how society responds to industrial toxins. It demonstrates the power of industry to delay regulation and suppress information about dangerous products. It shows how economic interests can be prioritized over public health. It reveals the difficulty of proving causation when exposure is widespread and effects are delayed. But it also shows how public pressure can drive change, even without government intervention. It demonstrates the power of personal testimony and emotional narrative to shift public opinion when scientific evidence alone is not sufficient. And it reveals the complex relationship between fashion, identity, and risk in a society where appearance was literally a matter of life and death for women. The women who wore arsenical green dresses were not fools. They were not ignorant or careless. They were people making rational choices within a system that valued beauty over safety, fashion over health, conformity over caution. They were operating with incomplete information in a context where the authorities they trusted, the fashion press, the manufacturers, the shops, all assured them the products were safe. And when they began to suspect otherwise, when they experienced illness, when they heard warnings, they faced enormous pressure to ignore those warnings. To reject fashionable green was to reject fashion itself, to mark oneself as unfashionable, old-fashioned, eccentric, for women whose entire social value depended on their appearance and their adherence to social norms. This was asking a great deal. We might judge them harshly from our modern perspective. We might wonder how anyone could value fashion over health, how anyone could wear something they suspected was poisoning them. But we face similar choices constantly. We use products we suspect may be harmful because they are convenient or because everyone else uses them. We ignore warnings because acknowledging them would require changing our behavior in inconvenient ways. We prioritize short-term social benefits over long-term health risks. The arsenic dress scandal is not just historical curiosity. It is a mirror that reflects our own choices, our own compromises, our own willingness to accept risk in exchange for beauty, convenience, or social acceptance. Consider the factory workers who made the arsenical pigments. They knew the work was dangerous. They saw their colleagues sicken and die, but they continued because they needed the wages. They had families to feed, rent to pay. The choice was not between a safe job and a dangerous job, but between a dangerous job and no job at all. In that context, accepting the risk of arsenic poisoning was rational. Consider the dressmakers and milliners who worked with arsenical fabrics every day. They too knew the work was making them ill, but they continued because this was their profession, their livelihood, their identity. To stop working with fashionable materials was to stop being competitive, to lose clients, to risk poverty. They made a calculated gamble that they could manage the risk, that the illness would not be so severe, that they would be among the lucky ones who survived. Consider the chemists and manufacturers who produced arsenical pigments. Some of them genuinely believed their products were safe, or at least acceptably risky. They saw the beautiful colors they could create, the commercial success, the contribution to fashion and art and industry. They rationalized the dangers, blamed problems on misuse or poor quality, and convinced themselves they were providing a valuable service. And consider the women who wore the dresses. They were caught in a system not of their making. They were told from birth that their value lay in their beauty and their ability to attract a husband. They were taught that following fashion was essential to social success. They were bombarded with advertising and editorial content promoting arsenical green as the height of elegance. When they experienced illness, they were told it was their imagination, their weak, feminine constitution, anything but the dress. The arsenic dress scandal reveals the violence inherent in beauty standards, the way society can demand that women, in particular, sacrifice their health and well-being for appearance. It shows how commercial interests can exploit and reinforce these demands, and it demonstrates the courage required to resist, to prioritize health over fashion, to reject social norms, even at the cost of social acceptance. But let us return to our young woman in the green dress at the ball in 1862. She has danced her for dances, felt unwell, gone home. Over the following weeks, she wears the dress several more times, each time feeling ill afterward. She begins to suspect the dress is the problem. She raises this with her mother, who dismisses her concerns. She raises it with her doctor, who suggests she is suffering from nervous exhaustion and prescribes rest. Frustrated, she takes matters into her own hands. She removes the dress from her wardrobe and refuses to wear it. She also disposes of her green ribbons, her green gloves, her green bonnet with its artificial flowers. Her mother is horrified at this waste of expensive clothing, but the young woman is adamant. Within weeks, she notices improvement. The headaches fade. The skin rushes clear. Her energy returns. She feels vindicated, but also angry. She has been made ill by something she was told was safe. She has been dismissed and patronized when she tried to raise concerns. She has been valued for her appearance, while her health was disregarded. She begins to talk about her experience with other young women. She discovers she is not alone. Many of them have similar stories of illness associated with green clothing. They begin to share information, to warn each other, to avoid green dresses, even though this makes them slightly unfashionable. This kind of informal network, women sharing information and looking out for each other, was crucial to raising awareness about arsenical dyes. It operated below the level of official medical or governmental channels, but it was effective. Women warned their daughters, their friends, their dressmakers. They voted with their purses, refusing to buy green, even when assured it was safe. And slowly, market forces began to shift. Dressmakers noticed that clients were requesting other colors. Fabric merchants saw demand for green declining. The fashion press, always sensitive to trends, began featuring other shades. Green's dominance began to wane, not because it was banned, but because women refused to wear it. This is not to say the problem disappeared quickly or completely. Arsenical pigments continued to be used in many products for decades. Children's toys were particularly dangerous because children put things in their mouths, directly ingesting arsenic. Wallpaper remained hazardous well into the 20th century, and some clothing, particularly cheap imported goods, continued to use arsenical dyes long after they had fallen out of favor in high fashion. But the peak of the crisis, the period when virtually everyone who could afford it was wearing arsenical green, was relatively brief, from roughly 1850 to 1880. And the scandal left lasting impacts on consumer protection, on chemical regulation, on medical understanding of occupational and environmental toxins. It also contributed to changing attitudes about fashion and women's health. The idea that women should sacrifice their well-being for beauty began to be questioned, at least by some. Reformers argued for more rational dress, for clothing that did not require tight corseting or multiple heavy layers, for fashion that prioritized comfort and health over appearance. These dress reform movements had limited success in the 19th century. Most women were not willing to give up fashionable dress, even for health reasons. The social penalties were too severe, but the movements planted seeds that would eventually grow into more significant changes in women's fashion. In the early 20th century, the arsenic dress scandal also contributed to the emerging field of toxicology and to public awareness of industrial poisons. It demonstrated that products could be dangerous even when used as intended, that manufacturers could not always be trusted to prioritize safety over profit, that government regulation might be necessary to protect consumers. These were radical ideas in the mid-19th century. The prevailing philosophy was caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. The idea that government should intervene in the market to protect consumers was controversial. But cases like arsenical dyes, where the danger was invisible and where consumers could not reasonably be expected to assess the risk themselves, made a strong argument for regulation. The scandal also raised questions about who bears responsibility when products cause harm. Were the chemical manufacturers responsible for creating poisonous pigments? Were the fabric dyers responsible for using them? Were the dressmakers responsible for sewing them into clothing? Were the retailers responsible for selling them? Were the fashion magazines responsible for promoting them? Or were consumers responsible for choosing to buy and wear them? These questions did not have clear answers then, and they remain contentious today. Product liability law emerged partly from cases like arsenical poisoning, attempts to create legal frameworks for assigning responsibility and providing compensation when products cause harm. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the arsenic dress scandal was cultural and psychological. It shattered the Victorian assumption that science and industry were unambiguously beneficial, that modern synthetic products were automatically superior to natural ones. It revealed that progress could be poisonous, that the new was not always better, that human cleverness could create dangers as easily as solutions. This loss of innocence, this recognition that industrial modernity came with costs and risks, was part of a broader shift in consciousness that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. People began to question whether economic growth and technological advancement were worth the human and environmental costs. They began to demand that those costs be acknowledged and addressed rather than ignored or denied. The arsenical greens faded from fashion, but their shadow lingered. They became a cautionary tale, a reminder that beauty can be deadly, that what glitters may be poisonous, that we should question what we are told by those who profit from our consumption. And yet, the fundamental dynamics that created the arsenic dress scandal persist. We still live in a world where appearance matters enormously, where social pressure to conform is intense, where commercial interests promote products without fully disclosing risks, where regulatory systems lag behind technological change, where individual consumers struggle to assess dangers that are invisible and cumulative. We still face choices between what is fashionable and what is safe, between what is socially rewarded and what is healthy. The specifics change, the products change, but the underlying patterns remain. The young woman who refused to wear her green dress in 1862 was making a choice that women continue to make today. She was prioritizing her health over social acceptance. She was trusting her own experience over expert assurances. She was willing to be slightly unfashionable, slightly eccentric, in order to protect herself. It required courage then. It requires courage now, because the pressures to conform, to be beautiful by current standards, to use the products everyone else uses, remain powerful. And the voices that say it is safe, everyone does it, you are worrying over nothing, remain loud and well. Funded. The arsenic dresses are gone now. They survive only in museum collections, carefully preserved behind glass. Still brilliant green, after more than a century. Still beautiful, still deadly. They are artifacts of a particular moment in industrial history. Examples of how fashion and chemistry and commerce and social pressure can combine to create elegant instruments of death. But they are also warnings. They remind us to question what we are told, to trust our own bodies, to consider who benefits when we are told not to worry, to recognize that beauty standards are not natural or inevitable, but are constructed and can be resisted, to understand that individual choices happen within systems of power and that challenging those systems, even in small ways, matters. The women who wore arsenical green were not foolish. They were navigating a complex world with limited information and intense pressure. Some of them got sick. Some of them died. But some of them noticed the pattern, questioned the authorities, shared information with each other, and chose differently. They began the slow process of change that eventually made arsenical dye as unacceptable. We honor them by learning from their experience, by applying their lessons to our own context, by maintaining the skepticism and courage they showed. The specific poisons change, but the need to question, to resist, to prioritize well-being over appearance remains constant. And so the ballrooms fell silent, one by one. The green dresses were put away in attics and closets, too expensive to discard but too frightening to wear. The wallpaper was stripped from walls. The artificial flowers were thrown away. The fashion magazines promoted new colors, new styles, never quite acknowledging what had happened. Why green suddenly seemed less appealing. The women who had been made ill mostly recovered, though some carried lasting damage. The ones who had died were buried and mourned and gradually forgotten. The manufacturers moved on to other products, other dyes, new markets. The scandal faded into history, remembered by specialists, but forgotten by the general public, until archaeologists and historians, more than a century later, began to examine those preserved dresses in museum collections, until they analyzed the fabric and found the arsenic, still present, still poisonous, until they pieced together the story from medical journals and coroners' reports and personal letters and newspaper articles, until they resurrected this strange, terrible episode, and asked what it could teach us. And what it teaches us is this: beauty has always had a price, but we get to decide if that price is acceptable. Fashion has always created pressure to conform, but we can choose to resist. Industries have always prioritized profit over safety, but we can demand better. And when our bodies tell us something is wrong, we should listen, even when everyone else insists we are imagining things. The arsenic dress scandal was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of industrial poisoning that characterized the 19th century. As factories proliferated and new chemicals were synthesized, workers and consumers were exposed to substances whose dangers were not understood or were deliberately concealed. Arsenic in dresses was just one manifestation of this larger problem. Consider the match industry, where young women and girls worked dipping wooden splints into white phosphorus to create the phosphorus caused a condition called phossy jaw, where the jawbone would literally rot away, creating oozing wounds and unbearable pain. The condition was often fatal. Yet the match factories continued to use white phosphorus for decades because it was cheap and effective, and the workers were expendable. Or consider the hat-making industry, where mercury was used in the felting process. Hatters absorbed mercury vapor day after day, developing tremors, personality changes, hallucinations, hence the phrase, mad as a hatter. The industry knew mercury was causing the madness, but continued using it because no equally effective alternative was available, or at least none that was as profitable that. Or consider the radium dial painters, mostly young women, who painted watch faces with radium-based, luminous paint in the early 20th century. They were told to lick their brushes to keep them pointed, ingesting radium with every lick. They developed horrific cancers, their bones literally glowing with radioactivity. The companies that employed them insisted the radium was harmless, even as their workers died agonizing deaths. These cases share common elements with the arsenic dress scandal. Workers and consumers exposed to industrial toxins, companies that prioritized profit over safety, authorities that dismissed or suppressed evidence of harm, victims who were told their symptoms were imaginary or due to their own weakness. Is low, often incomplete regulatory responses that came only after massive public pressure. They also share another element. The victims were disproportionately women and girls. This was not coincidental. Women and girls worked in industries that were considered appropriate for their gender. Light manufacturing like textiles, maches, watch dials. These industries tended to use dangerous chemicals and to pay low wages. Women workers had less power to demand safer conditions. Their health complaints were more likely to be dismissed as hysteria or female weakness. And as consumers, women bore the brunt of fashion-related poisoning because fashion mattered more for women. Men's clothing was relatively simple and changed little from year to year. Women's fashion was elaborate, constantly changing, and central to their social identity. Women were therefore more exposed to whatever dangerous substances fashion happened to be using at any given moment. The arsenic dress scandal thus intersects with issues of labor rights, consumer protection, women's health, and gender inequality. It cannot be fully understood without considering these broader contexts. The poison dresses were not just a chemical problem, but a social problem, rooted in how society valued different kinds of people and different kinds of risks. Returning to our young woman who refused to wear her green dress, we might ask what happened to her afterward. Did she marry? Did she have children? Did she live a long life? Or did the arsenic exposure she had already experienced shorten it? Widow, not. No, she is a composite, a representative figure standing in for thousands of real women who had similar experiences. But we can imagine, perhaps she married a few years later, a respectable match to a rising businessman. Perhaps she had 3 children and lived to see them grown. Perhaps she told her daughters about the green dress, warned them to be cautious about fashion, taught them to trust their own body. Perhaps those daughters told their daughters, passing down a family wisdom about the dangers hidden in beauty. Or perhaps she never fully recovered. Perhaps the arsenic she absorbed during those few wearings of the green dress accumulated in her organs, slowly poisoning her over years. Perhaps she developed chronic illness, mysterious symptoms that doctors could not explain. Perhaps she died young, in her 30s or 40s, the cause of death recorded as consumption, or nervous exhaustion, or simply female complaints. The arsenic connection never made. Both outcomes were common. Some women who wore arsenical dresses suffered no obvious long-term effects. Others were permanently damaged or killed. The difference often came down to the amount of arsenic in the particular garment, how long it was worn, how much the wearer perspired, individual variations in metabolism and susceptibility. It was a terrible lottery. What we do know is that many women did make the connection between their green clothing and their illness. Letters and diaries from the period contain references to throwing away green dresses, refusing to buy green fabric, warning friends and relatives. This grassroots awareness, spreading through personal networks, was at least as important as the medical and journalistic campaigns in changing behavior. Women also found creative ways to maintain fashion while avoiding arsenic. Some had green dresses, made with non-arsenical dyes, even though the colors were less brilliant. Some wore green only in small amounts, as trim rather than for entire garments. Some compromised by wearing arsenical green for short periods only, perhaps just for a portrait sitting, then carefully storing the dress away. These adaptations show how people navigate risk in real life. Complete avoidance was not always socially or economically feasible, but harm reduction was possible. And over time, as alternatives became available, the risky choice became less necessary. The development of those alternatives was driven partly by consumer demand, but also by scientific advancement. Chemists working on synthetic dyes were not initially focused on safety. They were trying to create colors that were bright, stable, and cheap to produce. But as awareness of arsenic dangers grew, they began specifically seeking non-toxic alternatives. The breakthrough came with the development of aniline dyes, derived from coal tar. William Henry Perkin accidentally discovered the first aniline dye, Movine, in 1856, while trying to synthesize quinine. The color, a purple shade, became immediately fashionable. More importantly, Perkin's discovery opened the door to an entire family of synthetic dyes that could produce virtually any color without using arsenic. By the 1880s, aniline dyes had largely replaced arsenical dyes in fashion. They were not without their own problems. Some aniline dyes caused skin irritation. Some contained other toxic substances, and the coal tar industry that produced them created terrible environmental pollution. But they were not acutely poisonous in the way arsenical dyes were. This transition illustrates an important point about technological change and risk. The solution to the arsenic problem was not a return to natural dyes, but the development of better synthetic dyes. Progress solved the problem that progress had created, though it also created new problems in the process. This pattern recurs throughout industrial history. A technology creates harm. Public awareness grows. Pressure mounts for change. A new technology emerges that addresses the original harm but may introduce new risks. The cycle continues. We do not return to a pre-industrial Eden, but move forward, trying to make technology less harmful while retaining its benefits. The arsenic dress scandal also reveals something about how scientific knowledge develops and the danger of arsenical pigments was not a sudden discovery. Chemists had known from the beginning that arsenic was poisonous. The question was whether the arsenic in fabric, wallpaper, and other consumer goods posed a practical danger. Early evidence came from case reports. Individual doctors noticing that patients who wore green dresses or lived in houses with green wallpaper seemed to get sick more often. But case reports are not proof. They can suggest a connection, but cannot prove causation. Other factors might be responsible. Stronger evidence came from experiments. Chemists showed that arsenic could be scraped from fabrics and that this arsenic could kill laboratory animals. They showed that perspiration could leach arsenic from fabric. They measured the amount of arsenic in the air in rooms with arsenical wallpaper and showed it safe levels. But even this evidence faced resistance. How much arsenic was dangerous? What counted as safe? These questions did not have clear answers. Dosage matters enormously with toxins. The amount that will kill you acutely is very different from the amount that will make you chronically ill over years. An individual susceptibility varies. What is safe for one person may be dangerous for another. This uncertainty was exploited by those who wanted to deny the problem. They could always argue that the doses in consumer products were too low to cause harm, that other factors were responsible for illness, that the evidence was not conclusive. And technically, they were not entirely wrong. The evidence was not conclusive by modern standards. The science of toxicology was still developing. Dose-response relationships were not well understood. But the precautionary principle, the idea that when something seems dangerous, we should err on the side of caution, was not widely accepted in the 19th century. The burden of proof was on those claiming danger, and that proof was difficult to establish definitively. This created a frustrating situation where doctors and activists knew that arsenical products were causing harm but struggled to prove it to the satisfaction of industry and regulators. They could point to individual cases, to experimental evidence, to the fact that workers who handled arsenical pigments got sick and died, but they could not produce the kind of epidemiological studies that would be considered definitive today. Such studies were not even possible with the resources and methods available at the time. Statistics were primitive. Medical record-keeping was inconsistent. Control groups were not used. Confounding factors were not properly accounted for. The tools needed to definitively prove what everyone intuitively knew did not yet exist. So change came not primarily from scientific proof, but from accumulating anecdotes, from emotional appeals, from market forces, from the growing consensus that, regardless of whether it could be proven to everyone's satisfaction, arsenical products were not worth the risk. This is not how we like to think science influences policy. We like to imagine that clear evidence leads directly to rational decisions. But history shows that the process is messier. Evidence accumulates gradually. Some of it is clear, some ambiguous. Different groups interpret it differently based on their interests and biases. Social and economic factors shape which evidence is accepted and which is dismissed. Change comes from a complex interaction of science, activism, market forces, and shifting cultural values. The arsenic dress scandal is a case study in this messy process, and it offers lessons for how we deal with suspected toxins today. When a product seems to be causing harm, how much proof do we require before taking action? Who bears the burden of proof? Those claiming danger or those claiming safety? How do we balance economic interests against public health? How do we make decisions when evidence is incomplete and experts disagree? These questions remain contested. We see them in debates over pesticides, over industrial chemicals, over air and water pollution, over food additives, over electromagnetic radiation from phones and towers. The specifics differ, but the underlying dynamics are remarkably similar to those of the arsenic dress scandal. Consider the current debates over fast fashion and textile toxins. Modern clothing is often treated with chemicals to make it wrinkle-resistant, stain-resistant, flame-retardant, or to achieve certain colors or finishes. Some of these chemicals are suspected of causing health problems, from skin irritation to cancer, but the evidence is often incomplete or contested. The fashion industry insists the products are safe. Environmental and health advocates call for bans or restrictions. Consumers are left uncertain about what to believe or what to do. The parallels to the arsenical green scandal are obvious. We are still negotiating the same questions about beauty versus safety, profit versus precaution, individual choice versus collective protection. We have better science now, better regulations, more awareness, but the fundamental tensions remain. Or consider cosmetics, where heavy metals like lead are sometimes found in lipstick, where formaldehyde-releasing preservatives are used in shampoos, where phthalates are used in fragrances. The amounts are small. The industry claims they are safe, but some scientists and advocates argue that cumulative exposure from multiple products may pose risks, especially for certain vulnerable populations. Again, the echo of arsenic in cosmetics, which was common in the Victorian era. Women used arsenical compounds to achieve a fashionably pale complexion, just as they wore arsenical green dresses. The justification was the same. Beauty is worth some risk. The outcome was the same. Chronic poisoning, sometimes death. We like to think we are wiser now, that we have learned from past mistakes, and in some ways we are and have. Regulations are stronger. Testing is more rigorous. Information is more readily available, but the basic human motivations, the social pressures, the commercial incentives, these have not changed. People still want to be beautiful. Industries still want to profit. Societies still value appearance highly, especially for women. And individuals still face the difficult choice of how much risk to accept in pursuit of beauty or social acceptance. The women who wore arsenical green dresses were not so different from women today who use cosmetics containing questionable chemicals, who wear clothing made with toxic dyes and finishes, who undergo cosmetic procedures with uncertain long-term effects, who diet in unhealthy ways or exercise to damaging excess in pursuit of an ideal body. The specifics change, the underlying pattern persists. Beauty standards demand sacrifices. Commerce provides products to meet those demands. Individuals navigate the space between desire and danger, between conformity and caution, between what we are told is safe and what our bodies tell us. And just as in the 19th century, women today share information through informal networks. They warn each other about products that cause reactions. They research ingredients and companies. They organize boycotts and campaigns. They vote with their purchases. They demand better from manufacturers and regulators. They continue the work that began with women refusing to wear their green dresses. This is not to minimize the real progress that has been made. Regulations have improved. Testing has improved. Transparency has improved. We know much more about toxicology than the Victorians did. We have tools to detect and measure harmful substances that they could not have imagined. And we have stronger, though still imperfect, systems for holding companies accountable when their products cause harm. But we should not be complacent. New chemicals are being synthesized constantly, faster than they can be thoroughly tested. Global supply chains make it difficult to track what substances are in the products we use. Regulatory systems struggle to keep pace with technological change, and the same economic pressures that led manufacturers to use arsenical dyes, despite the dangers, still operate today. Moreover, we face new challenges that the Victorians did not. The scale of production is vastly larger. The environmental impact is greater. The complexity of chemical interactions is harder to predict. And the globalization of commerce means that products banned in one country can be made in another and sold in a third, creating a regulatory whack-a-mole situation. So what do? How do we protect ourselves and others while still living in a modern world that is saturated with synthetic chemicals? We can take individual actions, choosing products carefully, researching ingredients, avoiding obviously risky substances, listening to our bodies when they tell us something is wrong. But individual action is limited. We cannot research and avoid every potential danger. We should not have to. We need collective solutions. We can support stronger regulations and better enforcement. We can demand that companies prove safety rather than requiring consumers to prove harm. We can insist on transparency, on labeling, on independent testing. We can punish companies that conceal dangers or make false safety claims. We can provide resources for research into alternatives. We can also challenge the cultural values that create demand for risky products in the first place. Why do we value certain kinds of beauty so highly that people are willing to risk their health to achieve them? Why do appearance standards, especially for women, require such constant maintenance and modification? Why is natural not considered beautiful? Why is aging treated as something to be concealed or corrected rather than accepted? These are deeper questions, cultural and philosophical rather than merely regulatory. But they matter. Because as long as beauty standards demand constant intervention and modification, there will be markets for products that promise transformation, and some of those products will be harmful. The women who wore arsenical green were responding to beauty standards they had not created, and could not easily resist changing those standards, making space for different ways of being beautiful, reducing the pressure to conform. These would have protected them more effectively than any chemical regulation. The same is true today. We need better regulations, yes, but we also need more humane beauty standards, less pressure to achieve impossible ideals, more acceptance of natural variation and aging. We need to value people for more than their appearance. We need to create space for choices that prioritize health over appearance without social penalty, than banning a chemical. It requires changing culture, which is slow and difficult work. But it is necessary work. Because as long as appearance is overvalued and health undervalued, people will make harmful choices, and companies will profit from enabling those choices. The arsenic dress scandal offers no simple lessons, no easy answers. It is a complicated story about the interaction of chemistry, commerce, culture, and choice. It reveals both human ingenuity and human folly, both corporate greed and genuine ignorance, both victimization and agency. The women who wore the dresses were victims of a system that valued their appearance over their well-being. But they were also agents who made choices, shared information, resisted when they could, and gradually changed what was acceptable. They were neither merely passive victims nor fully empowered choosers, but somewhere in between, navigating limited options with imperfect information. We are in the same position. We face risks we did not create and cannot fully control. But we are not helpless. We can choose how to respond. We can learn from history. We can support each other. We can demand better from those with power. We can work to change the systems that create unnecessary risks. And we can remember the women in the green dresses. We can honor them by taking seriously the dangers hidden in beauty, by trusting our own experience over corporate assurances, by prioritizing health over appearance when the two conflict, by working to create a world where such choices are less often necessary. The ballrooms where they danced are dust now. The dresses are artifacts, carefully preserved behind glass, fading slowly despite all care, the brilliant green still visible but muted now, less fierce than it once was. The women themselves are long dead, their names mostly forgotten, their stories surviving only in fragments. A doctor's case note, a coroner's report, a letter in an archive, a newspaper story about a tragic death. But their lesson survives. Beauty can be deadly. Fashion can kill. And the price of ignoring warnings, of trusting assurances over experience, of prioritizing appearance over health, can be measured in suffering and death. We owe it to them to remember, to be skeptical, to be cautious, to question what we are told, to demand proof of safety, to support research and regulation, to share information, to look out for each other, to resist beauty standards that require harming ourselves, to imagine and work toward different ways of being, ways that value health and well-being as highly as appearance. The green dresses hang in museums now, behind glass, safe to view but not to touch, beautiful and terrible, elegant instruments of death, testaments to human vanity and human vulnerability, warnings carved in fabric and arsenic that whisper across the centuries. Be careful what you wear. Be careful what you value. Be careful of beauty that comes at too high a price tag. And in that whisper, perhaps, there is wisdom. Wisdom bought with suffering. Wisdom that should not have been necessary but was. Wisdom that we ignore at our peril. The past has lessons if we will listen. And the women in the green dresses, dead now for more than a century, still have something to teach us, if we will only pay attention. So let that lesson settle now. Let the image of those dresses fade gently from your mind. Let the ballrooms empty. Let the dancers rest. They have earned their rest. Those women who wore beauty and paid with their health, who danced in poison and died too young, who trusted and were betrayed, who suffered and warned others, who slowly, painfully, learned what should never have needed learning. Rest now yourself. Breathe easily. Know that you have heard the story. Know that you can learn from it. Know that you can make different choices. The green dresses are behind glass now, contained, unable to harm. And you can rest. Rest deeply. Dream of colors that are safe, of beauty that does not kill, of a world where appearance and health need not conflict. And rest. The story is told. The lesson is learned. And you can rest.